In October 1943, a German Gefreiter named Klaus Hoffmann was buried alive beneath the rubble of a destroyed observation bunker near the village of Nevel in what is now western Russia. He remained trapped underground for 72 hours. This is his story. The Eastern Front in the autumn of 1943 was a landscape transformed by war into something unrecognizable. Where forests had once stood, there were now fields of splintered stumps and craters filled with stagnant water. The ground itself had been churned so many times by artillery that in some sectors the topsoil had mixed with subsoil to create a grey-brown paste that never fully dried. Nevel, a small town in the Pskov Oblast, had changed hands twice already that year. The Germans had fortified it heavily during their occupation, but by October the Red Army was pushing westward with renewed strength, and the Wehrmacht's defensive positions were under constant pressure. Klaus Hoffmann was 24 years old. He had been drafted in 1941, just after the invasion of the Soviet Union began, and had spent the better part of 2 years on the Eastern Front. He was not an officer, not a decorated soldier, not someone whose name would appear in official histories. He was a radio operator assigned to the 290th Infantry Division, a unit that had been ground down through repeated engagements and rebuilt with replacement troops multiple times. By the fall of 1943, the division was holding a defensive line southeast of Nevel, tasked with preventing Soviet breakthroughs that might threaten the entire German position in the region. The bunker where Hoffmann was stationed was typical of German field fortifications built during this period. It was not the massive concrete pillbox of the Atlantic Wall or the elaborate underground complexes found in more static sectors. Instead, it was what the Germans called a Behelfsbunker, an improvised shelter constructed from whatever materials were available. The structure had been dug into a low rise that provided some natural elevation over the surrounding terrain. The walls were reinforced with logs cut from nearby forests, stacked horizontally and held in place with packed earth. The roof consisted of multiple layers, first a frame of heavy timber beams, then a lattice of smaller logs laid crosswise, then a thick layer of earth and sod, and finally sandbags arranged to absorb the impact of shell fragments. The entrance was a narrow L-shaped trench that turned sharply before reaching the main chamber, designed to deflect blast waves from direct hits near the opening. Inside, the bunker was cramped and perpetually damp. Condensation formed on the wooden walls and dripped steadily onto the earthen floor. There was barely enough room for 4 men to sit comfortably, and when all positions were manned, the space felt suffocating. Hoffmann's radio equipment took up a significant portion of the interior. A torn .FU.B1 field transceiver, its batteries, spare parts, code, books sealed in waterproof pouches, and the wire spool for the external antenna. The antenna itself had been strung between 2 charred tree trunks about 30 meters from the bunker entrance, camouflaged with branches and deliberately kept low to avoid drawing fire. The weather in October 1943 was miserable even by Eastern Front standards. The autumn rains had begun in late September and had not stopped. The temperature hovered just above freezing during the day and dropped below it at night. This created a slush of mud and ice that made movement difficult and rendered vehicles nearly useless off established roads. Soldiers on both sides suffered from trench foot, frostbite on their extremities, and respiratory infections that spread rapidly in the close quarters of bunkers and dugouts. The rain also degraded defensive positions. Trenches collapsed, sandbags rotted and split open. Wooden supports in bunkers swelled and shifted, creating gaps in the structure that allowed water and cold air to seep through. Hoffmann's unit had been in position for 11 days when the Soviet attack began. They had known it was coming. Reconnaissance patrols had reported increased activity across the line, and German artillery spotters had observed Soviet engineers moving up bridging equipment and assault guns. On the morning of October 14th, the bombardment started at 04:30 hours, while it was still dark. The sound was not the sharp crack of individual guns, but a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Hoffmann, who had been asleep on a pile of empty sandbags in the corner of the bunker, woke immediately. The impact of shells hitting nearby sent vibrations through the ground that he could feel in his chest. Soviet artillery doctrine in 1943 emphasized overwhelming firepower delivered in concentrated barrages. The guns used against German positions near Nevel included 76mm divisional guns, 122mm howitzers, and heavier 152mm gun howitzers. These weapons could fire high explosive shells, shrapnel rounds, and in some cases incendiary projectiles. The purpose of the preliminary bombardment was not necessarily to destroy every German position, but to suppress defensive fire, cut communication lines, destroy forward observation posts, and create a state of shock among the defenders that would last long enough for infantry and armor to close the distance. The bombardment continued for 90 minutes. Inside the bunker, Hoffmann and his 3 companions could do nothing but wait. One man, a 19-year-old from Saxony named Dietrich, pressed his hands over his ears and curled into a ball. Another, an older Feldwebel named Werner, sat with his back against the wall and methodically checked and rechecked his ammunition pouches, his face expressionless. The fourth man, whose name Hoffmann would later struggle to remember, chain-smoked cigarettes until the air inside the bunker became thick and acrid. Hoffmann himself tried to maintain contact with battalion headquarters, but the radio produced only static. The antenna wire had almost certainly been severed by shell fragments. When the barrage finally lifted, there was a brief period of relative silence, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the distant sound of small arms fire. Werner, the Feldwebel, ordered them to stand too. They grabbed their weapons and moved toward the bunker entrance. Hoffmann brought his MP-40 submachine gun, though as a radio operator he was not expected to engage in direct combat unless the position was being overrun. As they emerged from the L-shaped entrance trench, the scene outside was apocalyptic. The landscape had been rearranged. Trees that had been standing that morning were now reduced to jagged stumps. The earth was pockmarked with fresh craters, some of them large enough to hide a truck. Smoke drifted across the ground in thick, low-lying clouds that smelled of explosive residue and burned vegetation. The Soviet infantry attack came from the northeast, advancing in waves across open ground. German machine gun positions that had survived the bombardment opened fire, and the sound of the MG-42s was a distinctive tearing noise that rose above the general chaos. Hoffmann could see figures moving through the smoke, bent low and running in short bursts between craters. Soviet doctrine called for infantry to advance in multiple echelons, with the first wave absorbing the heaviest casualties, while subsequent waves exploited any gaps in the defensive line. It was a brutal calculus, but it worked, especially when the defenders had been sufficiently weakened by artillery. Werner ordered Hoffmann back into the bunker to attempt contact with headquarters again. Hoffmann complied, descending back into the narrow entrance trench and re-entering the main chamber. He sat down at the radio, adjusted the frequency dials, and began transmitting a standard report. Position under attack, infantry assault in progress, requesting artillery support on designated coordinates. There was no response. He repeated the message, speaking clearly into the microphone, despite the muffled sounds of gunfire and explosions outside. Still nothing. He checked the connections, examined the battery levels, and tried again. The radio was functioning, but either the antenna was completely destroyed or there was no one on the other end to receive the transmission. The bunker shuddered. It was a different sensation than the vibrations caused by distant artillery impacts. This was a sharp, violent jolt that threw Hoffmann against the radio table. Dust and small particles of dirt fell from the ceiling. Then came a sound unlike anything he had experienced. A deep groaning, almost organic, as if the earth itself was in pain. The wooden support beams were shifting. Hoffmann looked up and saw the central roof beam bowing downward, the wood fibers compressing and splintering. He had just enough time to realize what was happening before the entire structure collapsed. The weight of the earth, the logs, the sandbags, and everything else that had comprised the bunker's roof came down in a single catastrophic failure. Hoffmann's world became a chaos of falling debris, crushing pressure, and absolute darkness. He felt something strike his left shoulder with tremendous force, spinning him sideways. His head hit something hard, possibly the radio table. There was a brief flash of light inside his skull, not from any external source, but from the impact itself, and then he lost consciousness. When Hoffmann woke, he had no idea how much time had passed. It could have been minutes or hours. His first sensation was pain, a throbbing ache that radiated from multiple points on his body. His left shoulder felt wrong, dislocated or broken, he could not tell. His head pounded. But more immediately distressing was the realization that he could not move. There was weight pressing down on him from above, an immense, suffocating pressure that made it difficult to breathe. He tried to shift his position and found that he could move his right arm slightly, perhaps 10 or 15 centimeters, but his left arm was pinned. His legs were similarly trapped. He was lying on his side, curled into a fetal position, wedged into what felt like a very small space. The darkness was total. Hoffman opened and closed his eyes several times to confirm that they were actually open. There was no difference. He tried to call out, to shout for help, but his voice sounded strange, muffled and weak, absorbed by the earth surrounding him. He called for Werner, for Dietrich, for anyone. There was no response. He listened intently for any sound that might indicate the presence of others, but heard nothing except his own breathing and the faint creaking of wood under pressure somewhere nearby. Hoffman's training had included basic instruction on survival in field conditions, but nothing had prepared him for this. He forced himself to think methodically. First, assess your situation. He was buried, that much was clear. The bunker had collapsed. He was alive, which meant there was air, at least for now. He was injured but conscious. Second, conserve energy. Panicking would only exhaust him and consume oxygen more quickly. Third, attempt to free yourself or signal for rescue. He began to explore his immediate environment by touch, using his right hand to feel around in the confined space. His fingers encountered a jumble of objects. The radio, or what was left of it, seemed to be wedged against his chest. He could feel the metal casing and the sharp edges where it had been damaged. There were pieces of wood, some large and some small, forming a chaotic lattice around him. There was earth, loose and damp, that shifted when he touched it. He realized that he was in a small void, a pocket that had formed when the bunker collapsed, probably created by the way the debris had fallen and interlocked. The pocket was not much larger than his body, perhaps half a meter wide and a meter long, with a height of maybe 40 or 50 centimeters. It was, quite literally, a coffin of earth and timber. The air was thick and stale. Hoffman noticed that each breath required more effort than the last. The oxygen in his small pocket was being depleted with every exhalation, replaced by carbon dioxide. He knew, intellectually, that this was how death would come if he was not rescued quickly. Not from crushing, not from injury, but from suffocation. The thought triggered a spike of panic that he had to actively suppress. He focused on breathing slowly and shallowly, trying to conserve what air remained. Time became meaningless. In total darkness, with no external reference points, Hoffman's perception of its passage became distorted. He would later estimate that he spent the first several hours simply lying still, trying to control his fear and assess his situation. But he could not be certain. It might have been less. It might have been more. Occasionally, he thought he heard sounds from above, distant explosions, the rattle of machine gun fire, voices shouting. But he could not tell if these sounds were real or if his mind was creating them. The isolation was profound. He had never experienced anything like it. Even in the worst moments of combat, there had always been other people nearby. The sense of shared experience. Now there was nothing but the darkness and the pressure and the slowly diminishing air. Hoffman began to dig. Using his right hand, he clawed at the earth above him, pulling down small amounts of dirt and pushing it to the side. It was exhausting work. The soil was dense and packed, mixed with clay that stuck to his fingers. For every handful he removed, more seemed to slide down from above to take its place. He could not tell if he was making any progress. He dug until his fingernails tore and his hand was raw and bleeding, then rested, then dug again. He told himself that he was moving upward, toward the surface, but he had no way to know for certain. For all he knew, he was simply redistributing the same earth within his pocket, accomplishing nothing. The pain in his shoulder intensified, movement aggravated it, but remaining still was not an option. He had to try. He continued digging, pausing frequently to rest and conserve oxygen. At some point he realized he was becoming lightheaded. His thoughts were less clear. He found it difficult to focus on what he was doing. He knew these were symptoms of oxygen deprivation. His body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions in an attempt to preserve life. He experienced a strange detachment, as if he was observing himself from outside his own body, watching a man trapped underground slowly dig himself deeper into exhaustion. Thirst became a problem. His mouth was dry, his tongue felt swollen, and his throat was raw from breathing the dusty air. He had no water. In his rushed exit from and return to the bunker, before the collapse, he had not thought to bring his canteen. It was probably buried somewhere nearby, crushed or intact, he would never know, but utterly inaccessible. He tried to generate saliva by moving his tongue, but his mouth was too dry. He thought about the rain that had been falling for weeks, the mud that was everywhere on the surface, and the irony that he was dying of thirst while surrounded by moisture-saturated earth. Hoffman's mind began to wander. He thought about his family in Hamburg, his mother who had cried when he left for the Eastern Front, his younger sister who had written him letters filled with trivial news about school and friends and daily life in a city increasingly damaged by Allied bombing. His father, a dock worker who had said very little when Hoffman was conscripted, but whose handshake had conveyed everything. He wondered if they would ever know what happened to him. Would he be listed as missing, killed in action? Would there be enough of him left to identify if and when the position was eventually overrun and someone bothered to dig through the rubble? He began to hallucinate. Or perhaps he was dreaming. It was difficult to distinguish. He saw light where there was none, bright and warm, streaming through a window in his family's apartment. He heard voices, conversations that made no sense, fragments of memories mixed with invented dialogue. He saw his sister's face, but she was speaking in Russian, which was impossible because she did not know Russian. He felt hands touching him, lifting him, but when he tried to respond, he realized no one was there. These episodes came and went. During the lucid moments in between, he was frightened by how easily his mind was coming unmoored from reality. At some point, he stopped digging. He could no longer feel his right hand. It was simply too much effort to continue. He lay still in the darkness, his breathing shallow and rapid, and waited. He was not consciously waiting for anything in particular. He had no real hope of rescue. The logical part of his mind understood that if the bunker had collapsed during an attack, his unit had likely been forced to withdraw or been wiped out. No one knew he was here. Even if they did, the amount of earth and debris above him would require heavy equipment and many hours of labor to clear. He was going to die here. He accepted this. The acceptance brought a strange kind of peace. But death did not come. The hours continued to pass. Hoffman drifted in and out of consciousness. His dreams became more vivid. He was walking through Hamburg, but the streets were empty and the buildings were unfamiliar. He was back in training, on a firing range, but the targets were shooting back. He was in the bunker again, before the collapse, and Werner was speaking to him, but the words were incomprehensible. He woke, if waking was the right word for the state he was in, and found himself still trapped, still alive, still suffocating by degrees. The human body can survive for 3 to 4 days without water, though cognitive function degrades rapidly after the first day. It can survive for weeks without food, though strength diminishes progressively. But without oxygen, death comes in minutes. Hoffman's continued survival suggests that his pocket, small as it was, had some minimal air circulation, perhaps through gaps in the debris that allowed small amounts of fresh air to seep down from the surface. This air would have been insufficient for comfort or normal function, but it was enough to keep him alive in a reduced state. His body went into a kind of hibernation mode, conserving every possible calorie and conducting only the most essential metabolic processes. On the surface, the battle for the sector had continued. Soviet forces had breached the German line in several places, forcing a tactical withdrawal. The Germans had conducted a counterattack on the morning of October 15th, temporarily regaining some of the lost ground, but by the evening they had withdrawn again to a secondary defensive position approximately 2 kilometers to the west. The area where Hoffman's bunker had stood was now in no man's land, a strip of churned earth between the two armies that was subjected to intermittent artillery fire from both sides but held by neither. It was a German reconnaissance patrol that found him. On October 17th, 3 days after the bunker collapse, a small group of soldiers was sent forward to observe Soviet positions and identify any salvageable equipment or wounded who might still be alive in the abandoned sector. The patrol consisted of 5 men, led by an Unteroffizier named Paul Richter. They moved carefully through the devastated landscape, wary of Soviet patrols and snipers. When they reached the area where the German positions had been, they found destruction so complete that it was difficult to identify where specific fortifications had stood. One of the patrol members, a young soldier named Franz, heard something. It was a faint sound, barely audible over the wind and the distant rumble of artillery. He signaled for the others to stop and listen. They heard it too, a weak, irregular tapping, coming from beneath a large mound of earth and debris that might once have been a bunker. Richter ordered them to investigate. They began clearing away the debris, working quickly but carefully, aware that they were exposed and vulnerable. As they dug, the tapping stopped. They feared they were too late, but continued anyway. After perhaps 20 minutes of digging, they broke through into a small void. Franz, who was leading the excavation, shone his flashlight into the opening and saw a man's face, or what remained of it. The face was caked with dirt, the eyes sunken and barely open, the lips cracked and bleeding. The man was alive but unresponsive. They widened the opening and pulled him out. It took 3 of them to extract him because his body was entangled with pieces of the collapsed bunker. When they finally got him into the open air, they laid him on the ground and assessed his condition. Hoffman remembered very little of the rescue. He had vague impressions of light, painfully bright after days of absolute darkness, and of hands touching him, lifting him. He remembered pain, intense and overwhelming, as his injured shoulder was jostled during the extraction. He remembered trying to speak but being unable to form words. His throat was too dry, his tongue too swollen. Someone gave him water, small sips, and he choked on it at first before managing to swallow. The taste was indescribable, the most wonderful thing he had ever experienced. The patrol could not carry him back immediately. They were too far from friendly lines, and Hoffman was in no condition to be moved quickly. Richter made the decision to stabilize him as best they could and wait for nightfall before attempting the journey back. They found a partially intact trench nearby and moved Hoffman into it, covering him with a blanket they had brought. One man stayed with him while the others completed their reconnaissance. Hoffman drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the day, aware of voices and movement, but unable to fully grasp what was happening. After dark, they carried him back. It took several hours. They had to move slowly to avoid detection and to navigate the difficult terrain. Hoffman was delirious for most of the journey. He muttered incoherently, sometimes in German, sometimes in what sounded like nonsense. The men carrying him took turns, switching off every few hundred meters because the weight was exhausting. When they finally reached German lines, Hoffman was immediately transported to a field hospital located in a requisitioned schoolhouse about 15 kilometers behind the front. The medical staff who examined him were astonished he was alive. His condition was critical. He was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from acute oxygen deprivation. His left shoulder was dislocated, and he had several fractured ribs. His hands were badly damaged from his attempts to dig, with torn fingernails and deep lacerations that had become infected. He had lost significant body weight in just 3 days. His cognitive function was impaired. He could not answer simple questions coherently. The doctors gave him fluids intravenously, treated his infections with sulfonamide drugs, and relocated his shoulder. They kept him sedated for the first 2 days to allow his body to begin the recovery process. Hoffman's memory of the week following his rescue was fragmentary. He remembered the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and blood. He remembered a doctor with wire-rimmed glasses who examined him daily. He remembered other wounded men in beds around him, some groaning in pain, others silent. He remembered nightmares, vivid and terrifying, in which he was back in the collapsed bunker, digging frantically but making no progress. The air running out, the darkness absolute. It took Hoffman nearly 3 weeks to recover sufficiently to speak clearly about his experience. A medical officer interviewed him, partly out of professional interest and partly because the circumstances of his survival were unusual enough to warrant documentation. Hoffman described what he remembered: the collapse, the darkness, the attempts to dig, the hallucinations. the gradual acceptance of death. The medical officer took notes and filed a report, though it is unclear whether this report was ever disseminated beyond the divisional level. The German military in 1943 was not particularly concerned with individual survival stories. They had more pressing matters to address. Hoffmann was eventually transferred to a hospital in Germany for continued recovery. His physical wounds healed, though his left shoulder never regained full mobility. The psychological effects were more persistent. He experienced recurring nightmares for years. He developed a fear of enclosed spaces that made certain aspects of civilian life difficult. He avoided basements and crowded rooms. He could not tolerate darkness without a source of light nearby. These symptoms, which we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, were at the time poorly understood and largely untreated. He did not return to the Eastern Front. By the time he was physically capable of active service again, it was early 1944, and the German military situation had deteriorated to the point where experienced soldiers were in desperately short supply. However, Hoffmann's injuries qualified him for reassignment to a rear echelon position. He spent the remainder of the war working in a communications depot in Bavaria, far from the front lines. He survived the war and returned to Hamburg, which had been largely destroyed by Allied bombing. He found work at the docks, married, had children, and lived what appeared from the outside to be an ordinary post-war life. But he never spoke about what happened at Nevel. His family knew he had been wounded, knew he had served on the Eastern Front, but he volunteered no details, and they did not press him. This was not unusual. Many veterans of the Eastern Front carried their experiences in silence, unable or unwilling to articulate what they had endured. The trauma was too deep, too personal, too incomprehensible to those who had not been there. The survival of a soldier buried alive for 72 hours was, and remains, an extraordinary medical phenomenon. The factors that allowed Hoffmann to survive were numerous and interconnected. The formation of the air pocket, however small, was crucial. Without it, he would have suffocated within minutes. The fact that this pocket maintained some minimal air circulation, likely through small gaps in the debris, kept him alive. His body's ability to enter a reduced metabolic state conserved oxygen and energy. His youth and prior good health gave him reserves of strength to draw upon. And perhaps most importantly, there was luck. If the debris had fallen slightly differently, the pocket might not have formed. If the reconnaissance patrol had passed 100 meters to either side, they would never have heard his tapping. If the battle had gone differently, the area might have remained under Soviet control, and no German patrol would have been sent forward at all. Bunker collapses were not uncommon on the Eastern Front. The improvised nature of many fortifications, combined with the intensity of artillery bombardments, meant that structures failed regularly. In most cases, those buried were killed instantly by the collapse itself, or died within a short time from injuries or suffocation. There are scattered references in military records and memoirs to soldiers being dug out alive from collapsed positions, but the time frame was typically measured in hours, not days. Hoffmann's case stands out for the duration of his entombment and the fact that he retained enough consciousness to attempt self-rescue and signal to his rescuers. The broader context of the fighting near Nevel in October 1943 is significant. This was part of the Soviet Nevel offensive operation, which aimed to liberate the town and create a salient that would threaten German communications in the region. The operation began on October 6th and continued into early November. It was one of many Soviet offensives launched in the second half of 1943 as the Red Army pushed westward following the German defeat at Kursk. The Germans were conducting a fighting retreat, attempting to slow the Soviet advance and inflict maximum casualties while preserving their own forces for continued resistance. The sector where Hoffmann's unit was positioned was not strategically critical, but it was part of the larger defensive line that the Germans were desperately trying to maintain. The 290th Infantry Division, Hoffmann's unit, was among the many German formations ground down during this period. It had been formed in 1940 and had participated in the invasion of France before being transferred east. By 1943, it bore little resemblance to the division that had entered the Soviet Union in 1941. Casualties had been so severe that the unit had been rebuilt multiple times with replacement troops, many of them poorly trained and inadequately equipped. The division was eventually destroyed in the summer of 1944 during the Soviet Operation Bagration and was never reformed. Hoffman's story is nearly forgotten today. There are no monuments commemorating his survival, no plaques marking the location of the collapsed bunker. The battlefield near Nevel has long since returned to forest and farmland, and the physical traces of the war have been erased by decades of weathering and human activity. Hoffman himself left behind no written account of his experience. What we know comes from fragmentary medical records, a brief mention in the after-action report of the reconnaissance patrol that rescued him, and second-hand accounts from family members who heard pieces of the story in his later years. This forgetting is perhaps understandable. The Eastern Front was a conflict of such vast scale and horror that individual stories, no matter how remarkable, tend to be subsumed by the sheer weight of collective suffering. Millions died, cities were destroyed, entire populations were displaced. Against this backdrop, the survival of one soldier in one collapsed bunker seems almost insignificant. But it is precisely these individual stories that reveal the human dimension of the war, the small moments of endurance and chance that determined whether someone lived or died. Hoffman's survival raises questions about the nature of human resilience. What allows a person to endure conditions that should, by all reasonable estimation, be fatal? Is it physical strength, mental fortitude, luck, or some combination of all three? The answer is probably different for each person and each situation, but Hoffman's case suggests that the human body and mind are capable of adapting to extremes in ways that we still do not fully understand. His ability to enter a reduced metabolic state, to ration his dwindling air supply, to maintain enough consciousness to signal for help after 3 days in total darkness and near suffocation, speaks to capacities that are rarely tested in ordinary life. There is also the question of what such experiences do to a person. Hoffman lived for more than 40 years after the war, but in what sense did he truly survive? The man who emerged from that collapsed bunker was not the same person who had entered it. The trauma, both physical and psychological, marked him permanently. He carried the darkness with him for the rest of his life, a burden invisible to those around him, but no less real for its invisibility. This is part of the legacy of war, the way it continues to affect those who endured it long after the fighting has stopped and the armies have gone home. Klaus Hoffmann died in 1989 at the age of 70 from complications related to emphysema. He is buried in a cemetery in Hamburg, his grave marked with a simple stone that gives no indication of what he endured during the war. His story survives in fragments, in scattered documents and fading memories, a small piece of the vast and terrible mosaic of the Second World War. It is a story worth remembering, not because it is heroic or inspiring in any conventional sense, but because it is true, because it happened, and because it reveals something essential about the brutality and randomness of war and the stubborn persistence of human life even in the face of almost certain death.